So maybe you've noticed that as soon as a person starts to speak about politics or to politics from a Christian perspective, without fail, someone is going to throw out the separation of church and state. And more often than not, it's used in an attempt to tell the Christian that they shouldn't bring their religion into the public or the political arena. Now, I do not deny that there is such a thing as the separation between church and state. Actually, I affirm it and I want it. As a Christian, I want the church and the state to remain distinct institutions. But I also want to make clear that the separation between the two is not what many people today try to make it. Historically, it has never meant that Christians cannot speak to politics, and it has never meant that our laws or our practices as a nation should disregard Scripture. In fact, I think we see that our laws as a nation primarily came from Scripture. Now, in the Constitution, more specifically the Bill of Rights, so the first 10 amendments that were added a few years later to the Constitution, they do explicitly state that there should not be an establishment of religion by the government. And really the reason why these amendments were added to the Constitution is because of a group of people called the Anti-Federalists who were worried and concerned that the government would get too big for its britches and start impinging upon people's rights. So I'll take the liberty to pull out my trusty Constitution here and go ahead and read to you the First Amendment where this law comes from. It states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So there's to be no establishment of religion. And the reason why this was so important, especially to the founders, is because many of the early colonists came from places where they did not have religious liberty. They came from places where they had been persecuted because they did not align with a certain denomination. And so it was wise to say that the government could not tell the people how they could or could not worship God. The people, the citizens, were to have the freedom to worship God according to their own conscience. So the focus here is on a freedom of religion. But people today quote that and they act like it's freedom from religion. And people today speak of it as though, as a Christian, I have no right to bring my religious theological beliefs into the civil sphere. But that is never what this meant. This was about protecting freedom of speech, freedom of religion, not banishing them. So when a Christian speaks publicly today about moral issues in the country, such as sexuality or marriage or the protection of life, and people say, keep that to yourself. Keep that in your church building. Don't shove your religion down my throat. You have no right to speak about God here. You have no right to speak about your beliefs here. This is what the First Amendment was written to protect. In fact, if the Constitution or the Bill of Rights applies in the way that these people want to make it apply, then obviously the Founding Fathers didn't understand what they themselves wrote. And I want to give some examples here to prove my point. George Washington, our first president, in his farewell address, so a letter written to the citizens of the country at the end of his presidency, in this he stated, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. So try and take God away, take biblical morality away, and then everything else unravels. John Adams, our second president, also in a letter wrote, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. He wrote in another letter, this one to Thomas Jefferson, the general principles on which the Founding Fathers, achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. Benjamin Rush is probably not as famous of a name, but he was also a signer of the Declaration, and he was Surgeon General of the U.S. He declared Christianity is the only true and perfect religion. Without this religion, there can be no virtue, and without virtue, there can be no liberty. So true religion gives us true virtue as a people, which produces true liberty. So without the moral standards of Christianity, we will lack the virtue that produces liberty. Sam Adams, who's known as the father of the American Revolution, another signer of the Declaration of Independence. He writes in a letter, "Religion and good morals are the only solid foundation of public liberty and happiness." So either the founding fathers were so stupid that they did not realize that they were allowing their Christianity to influence their civil activity, or they never understood the separation of church and state in the way that people do today. Another quote from Noah Webster, not a founding father, but he wrote the first dictionary in America, and it's named after him today, Webster's Dictionary, wrote, "The moral principles and precepts contained in the scriptures ought to form the basis of all our civil constitutions and laws." Again, this just goes to show the mindset and the belief system that shaped our nation. And this is what we must regain in order to sustain the nation. So again, I will say, yes, there's a distinction between the church and the state, and we should continue to recognize that. But it does not mean that the government is not to operate under God. It is, and it did from the beginning. Our morality, our laws, our precepts as a people came from a Christian understanding of the world. So I've tried to tell you so far what the separation of church and state isn't. Now let me try to tell you what it is. And I think it would be helpful to look at where the sentiment originated from. It's first found in a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson. And this letter was a response to one that he had received from a group of Christians in Connecticut. It's available online for you to read it. And if you do, you will see that their concern, their reason for writing to him was that in their state of Connecticut, they did not believe that the state constitution clearly enough spelled out their religious liberty. The state actually recognized the Congregationalist Church, and they were Baptist, and they were worried that the state would try to tell them that they had to conform to Congregationalism. They were worried that the state would eventually overreach and try to tell them what they could or could not preach, how they could or could not worship. And so in response to that letter, and I read, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, and that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So he's quoting the First Amendment. And then he says, "thus building a wall of separation between church and state." So this is where it comes from. This is where the phrase originates. He goes on writing, but I now just read the ending of the letter. "I reciprocate your kind prayers for the protection and blessing of the common Father and Creator of man, and tender you for yourselves and your religious association assurances of my high respect and esteem." So this is where the language of the wall of separation between the two institutions of the church and the state, this is where it comes from. And I hope you see that this letter has nothing to do with the idea that Christians should remain silent, that Christians should keep their beliefs to themselves, but rather this was a reassurance of the religious liberty that we have in this nation. Jefferson was telling these Baptists from Danbury, Connecticut, that they had the right to go on worshiping as they saw fit. So this language and this idea of Christians staying separate and out of political affairs is really a modern idea. And it's not what led to the prosperity of our nation. It's not what led to the overturning of slavery. It was Christians with a Bible in their hand and conviction in their heart being a prophetic voice to the government and to the nation. So the separation of the church and state does not mean that Christians have no voice. The founders obviously did not exemplify this in their beliefs or in their actions, and neither should we. Now, like the founders, we should understand the difference between the two, that the state is to keep a rule of law, it's to protect the rights of its citizens, it's to carry out justice. The church is to be a place of worship where the body of believers comes together for prayer and preaching and discipleship and to perform ordinances like baptism and marriage. The church and the state are separate, but that does not mean that they are mutually exclusive. In fact, they are to be beneficial to one another when they operate as God designed them to. And this is what we see from the beginnings of our nation. So one last time, let me make clear The founding fathers did not see Christianity as a threat to liberty, but rather they saw Christianity as its foundation. They never said anything like keep your faith to yourself, but rather they said things like we need religious morality to survive. So whenever Christianity is pushed out of the public square, I don't think that we can be surprised if we see justice follow closely behind. I don't think that we can be surprised to see liberty follow closely behind. Christianity, Christian truth, is what shaped this nation. And I want to tell you today, it's the only thing that will sustain this nation.